At 6:30 a.m. inside Dallas Love Field, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was humiliated by airport staff stripped of dignity and left watching her 710 flight vanish, while 246 passengers stared in stunned silence. Just minutes later, her husband retired. Federal Judge Franklin Rhodes walked through the terminal doors, turning humiliation into a reckoning no one expected. In a nation where power collides with prejudice every day, what would you have done if it happened to you? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The terminal buzzed with fluorescent light and hurried footsteps, but Jasmine Crockett moved through it like a shadow pulled forward by urgency. Her black dress clung with the quiet weight of grief, a blazer stiff against her shoulders, a coffee trembling in one hand, as if it alone could keep her upright. She had been living on borrowed energy for weeks, Sacramento, San Antonio, Tulsa cities, that blurred together in a haze of speeches and policy debates, but none of that mattered now. Today wasn't about politics. Today was about family, about a cousin who had felt like a brother, and a promise she refused to break. Dallas Love Field at dawn was no sanctuary. The crowd shifted like restless water families, clutching carry-ons, businessmen barking into phones, children dragging stuffed animals across tile floors. Jasmine weaved between them with precision, her phone lighting up with unread emails, her assistant's reminders stacked in merciless lines. Each vibration in her palm was another demand, but her eyes locked only on the southwest desk where her journey would begin. And then came the flicker, the glance, the smirk, the dismissive tilt of a stranger's mouth. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but to Jasmine it landed like a strike. She had seen that look in courtrooms and hearing rooms, in every space where her presence was questioned. She placed her ID and confirmation on the counter with practiced calm, the kind that came from years of refusing to let tone become ammunition. "I'm on flight 2376 to Jackson," she said, her voice steady. The clerk tapped keys, frowned, leaned back and muttered, "You're not in the system." The words hung heavier than the clicking keyboards behind him. Jasmine blinked once, then slid her phone across the boarding pass, glowing bright on the screen. "Checked in an hour ago," she replied, every syllable clipped with controlled patience. But instead of resolution, there was a pause, a sideways glance, and a call over his shoulder for backup. The second employee arrived with eyes already hardened posture, rigid with rehearsed authority. "She's flagged for random review," the woman said, not even looking at Jasmine. Random review, the phrase echoed like an accusation disguised as policy. Jasmine had flown this route 4 times this year. Never once had she been flagged. Yet here she stood, funeral dress beneath a blazer, watching precious minutes bleed away, while 2 strangers treated her existence like an inconvenience. She pressed her lips together, jaw tight, forcing composure against the rising tide of disbelief. "It must be a mistake," she said quietly, though the weight in her chest told her it wasn't. The line behind her grew restless. Passengers whispering, phones tilted to capture the scene. One voice whispered, "That's Congresswoman Crockett." But recognition did nothing to pierce the indifference of the staff. Their tone sharpened. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, we'll have to ask you to step aside." Her eyes widened, incredulous. "Calm down." She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved except to comply. Yet the trap was set, her dignity measured not by her credentials, but by their perception. The clock above the counter read 6:43 each second, slashing into the window between her and Jackson. Jasmine's chest tightened. She thought of her mother already at the church, of Devon's little girl, clutching tissues, waiting to hear her aunt speak. Missing this flight meant missing more than travel. It meant breaking a promise carved in grief. But here she was, pushed toward humiliation by the smirk of one man, the silence of another, and the quiet escalation of a system too used to dismissing voices it didn't value. She stood straighter, her pulse loud but her face unreadable, refusing to give them the spectacle they seemed to crave. And in that stillness, in that unbearable pause before the next blow, the air itself felt like it was waiting for the moment everything would snap. The clerk repeated it slower this time. "Random review. No reason. No explanation." Phones tilted higher, the red dots of recording lights blinking like warnings in the crowd. Jasmine Crockett lifted her government ID, the emblem of authority that should have ended the charade, but the clerk's eyes slid past it as though it were nothing more than laminated plastic. A hand went up. Two TSA officers appeared, crisp uniforms, polished shoes. "Ma'am, please come with us." 6:47 a.m. 3 minutes vanished. A father whispered behind her, "She's a congresswoman." His voice fell silent when the agent's glance cut his way. 6:50 a.m. boarding call for Group A. Jasmine's fingers tightened around her phone knuckles, pale, but she didn't flinch. 6:55 a.m. Another announcement. Final boarding. Her chest rose once steady as if she were inhaling the entire corridor. And then without resistance, she walked, head high, shoulders square, into the verdict they had already written. The hallway swallowed her, whole fluorescent lights humming like an interrogation room, every flicker sharpening the sense that this was no accident. Jasmine Crockett lifted her arms as ordered, her body searched with cold precision, hands running along seams of fabric that carried nothing but grief. Her bag was ripped open, toiletries, scattered papers, shuffled like they were contraband, the gold seal of her government ID ignored as if it were nothing more than a scrap of plastic. Each intrusion was another cut not just into her privacy, but into her dignity, stripped piece by piece, while the clock devoured her chance to say goodbye. Minutes bled into eternity. 10, then 15, the screen above her gate, now flashing, departed. Flight 2376 rolled down the runway, without her carrying strangers to their destinations, while she sat in a hard metal chair, forced into stillness she did not choose. Her cousin's face haunted her. The boy she had grown up with, the man taken too young, the promise she made to speak for him now silenced by strangers with smirks and clipped tones. Humiliation was one wound, but this was deeper. This was failure. Not professional, not political, personal. She inhaled sharply, forcing back the wave rising in her chest. The officers avoided her eyes, now shifting their weight, their silence more damning than words. Around them, the terminal continued like nothing had happened. Boarding calls echoing, coffee orders shouted, rolling suitcases rattling against tile. But for Jasmine, time stood still. She was here, broken open in plain sight, punished for nothing but asking a question. And worse, she knew this story wasn't unique. It had happened before, it would happen again, and only the cameras and strangers' hands had turned her pain into spectacle. Her fingers curled around her phone. The screen glowed faintly, waiting for her to speak the words she couldn't say aloud. For a long breath, she hesitated, pride fighting, need silence clashing with the fire that refused to die. Then she typed 3 words, each letter pressed like a verdict. "I need you." She hit send, the message slicing through the sterile air, heavier than any accusation. Her chest tightened, her jaw set. The humiliation was real, the loss irreversible. But this moment, this silence, would not end her. The phone dimmed in her hand. She stared forward, expression carved from steel, even as something inside her cracked with the weight of what she had just lost. And as the officers lingered, as the staff whispered, as the witnesses scrolled through their footage, the question pulsed louder than the intercom overhead. What does power look like when silence is weaponized against you? The chair was unforgiving, metal cold, and bolted to the floor, as if designed to strip away any trace of dignity. Jasmine Crockett sat in it without moving her posture, rigid, her blazer wrinkled from the searched strands of hair tumbling loose around her face. She looked like someone who had been through a storm, yet refused to bend under its weight. Her eyes locked not on the officers, not on the airline staff whispering nearby, but on a stain in the tile beneath her shoes, an anchor in a moment when everything else had been pulled out from under her. Around her, voices carried in hushed fragments, sharp enough to slice the silence, but too faint to grant clarity. Protocol. Random. She escalated. The words weren't meant for her, not really. They were meant for one another, a coded reassurance that this was routine, that no lines had been crossed. But the cracks in their tone betrayed them. They were downplaying, scrambling, twisting humiliation into procedure. Every syllable she overheard was another insult, another attempt to erase the reality of what had happened in plain view. Her chest ached, not from rage, but from grief that reached beyond the sterile walls of the terminal. Devin's face flashed before her. Not the man in a hospital bed, but the cousin who had laughed so hard he cried when they rode bikes as kids. She had promised his daughter she would speak, that Auntie Jazz would stand at the front of the church and tell the world who her father was. Now, as Flight 2376 cut through the clouds without her, that promise dissolved into the void. Somewhere in Jackson, her mother sat in the front pew, phone buzzing in her lap, checking the door every few minutes. Jasmine could almost see her mother's face, the line of disappointment hidden beneath practiced grace. Her absence weighed heavier than the smirk of any clerk or the cold hands of security. And yet humiliation was not the shape of her silence. Her stillness was deliberate, carved from years of being underestimated, dismissed, told to quiet down. The silence was not surrender. Beneath the calm surface, a fire roared low, controlled, unyielding. They wanted to see her break, to lash out, to give them the justification their whispers already hinted at. She would not. Each measured breath, each second of composure, was defiance. They had taken her flight, her moment with family, but they would not take her dignity. The officers leaned against the wall, arms folded, pretending to be relaxed, but their eyes darting their weight, shifting. They were waiting for her to cry, to rage, to stumble into the box they had drawn around her. Jasmine remained immovable, her silence heavier than their suspicion. Her hand rested on her phone screen, dim, but still carrying the glow of the 3 words she had sent. I need you. She replayed them in her mind, the message heavier than any courtroom ruling, more urgent than any speech she had ever given. The terminal outside carried on oblivious. Suitcases rattled against tiles, boarding calls blared, families laughed and reunited. Life surged ahead as if nothing had happened. But in that narrow hallway, time stood still. The world may have dismissed her as another passenger, delayed, another problem contained, but Jasmine Crockett knew better. In the hollow of absence, in the silence of failure, her pain was already transforming, not into weakness, but into steel. And when she rose from that chair, she would rise carrying more than her own weight. She would rise carrying the truth of what they had tried to bury. The automatic doors hissed open, spilling a gust of cold morning air into the suffocating hallway. Franklin Rhodes stepped through, tall, deliberate, wrapped in a gray coat and the maroon scarf Jasmine had given him last Christmas. He didn't hurry, didn't need to. Every step carried the weight of 30 years on the federal bench, a man who had never raised his voice to command a room, and yet always owned it. The hum of whispers thinned as if the terminal itself sensed a shift. Jasmine lifted her head, eyes locking with his. For the first time that morning, her composure softened just slightly, a flicker of relief buried beneath layers of steel. The TSA officers straightened, without meaning to their arms, unfolding their stance, tightening into something closer to attention. The young agent who had smirked before shrank a little, his bravado leaking away with each measured step Franklin took. Silence sharpened, no longer oppressive, but expectant, as though the ground itself was waiting for judgment. He stopped just a breath away from Jasmine, his eyes moving first to her wrinkled blazer, then to the scattered papers stuffed carelessly back into her bag, before finally returning to her face. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded once, not trusting her voice. Then he turned, the quiet warmth vanishing, his gaze cutting toward the nearest officer. "Who's in charge here?" The words weren't loud, but they sliced sharper than any shout. The officer hesitated, caught between protocol and presence, fumbling for an answer. "Sir, can I ask who you are?" Franklin's reply landed like a gavel, striking wood. Franklin Rhodes. "Retired federal judge, 9th Circuit. Now answer my question." The smirking agent swallowed hard color draining from his face, suddenly exposed under a spotlight no camera could replicate. Around them, passengers who had been pretending not to watch now leaned forward, phones tilted higher, recording what felt less like a scene and more like a reckoning. Authority without volume, it radiated from Franklin's every syllable, every pause, every breath. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't bluster. He simply occupied the space in a way that made everyone else feel small. The TSA officers shifted again, uneasy, their polished composure unraveling. One finally stammered, "I'll get a supervisor." But Franklin didn't move, didn't nod, didn't release the tension. His presence alone pinned the air to the floor, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Jasmine wasn't the one under scrutiny. They were. And as the hallway trembled under the weight of his calm fury, the unspoken truth became undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and silence, once weaponized against Jasmine, now belonged to Franklin. Franklin Rhodes didn't storm the hallway. He dismantled it with words. His presence alone redefined the air, as though the walls themselves had shifted into a chamber of judgment. Phones hovered higher, trembling in the hands of passengers who suddenly realized they were watching something larger than a travel dispute. They were witnessing a trial without a bench, without a robe, without a gavel, and yet far more real than any courtroom broadcast on television. He began with questions sharp and simple. Did she raise her voice? The silence stretched until the agent's lips parted with a reluctant number. Franklin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing not in rage but in precision. Did she refuse your instructions? Did she resist your line? Did she threaten anyone in this terminal? The agent's Adam's apple bobbed, his confidence collapsing. Another no followed, softer this time, almost swallowed by the fluorescent hum. Each denial was not just an answer, it was an admission. The crowd felt it, the TSA officers felt it, and Jasmine Crockett felt it in the marrow of her bones. For the first time that morning, the humiliation was no longer hers to carry. It had shifted onto the shoulders of the men who had orchestrated it. Franklin took another step closer, his shoes clicking like gavels against tile. Then tell me why she was treated like a criminal. Tell me why a sitting congresswoman en route to her cousin's funeral was forced to miss her flight while holding valid credentials in plain sight. The officer's silence was deafening. It was not the silence of authority, but the silence of guilt exposed. Passengers whispered, some too loudly. He's a judge. He's dismantling them. They have no answers. The hallway grew smaller with every second, tighter, as if the walls themselves were folding in under the weight of his calm fury. An airline supervisor arrived at last, breathless and pale, clipboard clutched like a shield. Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Rhodes, we deeply regret. Franklin sliced the apology in half with a single motion of his hand. Regret. She didn't need regret. She needed dignity 20 minutes ago. The words detonated in the silence, sending shockwaves through the onlookers. Phones caught every syllable, every flicker of shame on the faces of the agents. Jasmine stood still, her blazer wrinkled, her papers scattered, but her chin lifted high. She wasn't the spectacle anymore. The spectacle was the institution itself, stripped bare under Franklin's interrogation. She let the silence linger, let it choke the air, let it force the officers into the role of defendants. Her stillness was not surrender, it was evidence. And in that moment, as the crowd gasped and whispered, as the supervisors fumbled and the officers shrank, one truth became impossible to deny: power had shifted. The authority that once silenced her now sat trembling beneath the weight of its own collapse. The silence of the hallway didn't stay contained within its walls. Within minutes, the red recording lights that had glowed like fireflies in the crowd became torches carried into the digital world. A shaky clip surfaced, first Jasmine Crockett, head high, walking between TSA officers who wouldn't meet her eyes. The video was grainy, but the power in her silence burned through every pixel. By the time it hit Twitter, it was no longer just footage, it was fuel. Hashtags erupted like sparks on dry grass. Hashtag dignity denied, hashtag gate 22B, hashtag Crockett removed. Each post spread faster than the last passenger's whispers, mutating into tweets, retweets, stitched videos, and duets. A mother wrote, I saw her stand there, calm, silent, while they treated her like she didn't matter. And she's a congresswoman. Imagine how they'd treat the rest of us. Outrage brewed with the speed of wildfire, the kind no public statement could smother. Cable news producers clipped the footage within the hour, framing it against somber headlines. On TikTok, a 15-second loop of Jasmine holding out her ID in vain racked up millions of views before she even left the terminal. The comments section pulsed with fury. Why was she treated like a threat? If that's how they handle her, what about us? The question rippled across the nation, every scroll amplifying its echo. By noon, the footage had traveled from living rooms to newsrooms, from classrooms to church pews. Students paused lectures to watch. Office workers huddled around screens, whispering in disbelief. It was no longer an isolated humiliation in Dallas. It was America staring itself in the mirror, forced to confront an injustice broadcast in real time. And as the views climbed into the millions, the story hardened into something no one could dismiss. The phones didn't lie and the country was watching. The clip was only 15 seconds long, but by nightfall it had consumed the country. Every network had seized it. Every anchor replayed it. Over and over again, Jasmine Crockett standing silent, her government ID extended, while TSA officers refused to meet her eyes. No soundbite could overpower the image. No talking head could soften the stillness. The battle lines formed instantly. On one screen, a host leaned forward, voice sharp. This was routine, nothing more. On another, a commentator's tone burned. No, this was bias, pure and simple. The clash of words filled the airwaves like sparks from a live wire. But the storm didn't stay in studios. It invaded homes. In Detroit, a father muted the television halfway through dinner. He stared at his plate, then at his teenage son, and muttered, "That could have been me last year." His son nodded silent, the weight of recognition heavier than food. In Phoenix, a mother held her phone out to her daughter. The girl's eyes widened. "Mama, why are they treating her like that?" The mother had no answer, only a memory of Denver, 2019, when the same thing had happened to her. In a small-town classroom, students huddled around a glowing rectangle, ignoring the chalkboard behind them. One whispered, "They really made her miss a funeral." Another whispered back, "Imagine if it was your mom." The teacher didn't stop them. She stood frozen too, watching the loop again and again. The footage crossed every boundary. Offices, subway cars, dorm rooms, church basements. It was no longer about one congresswoman. It was about every silent humiliation the country had quietly carried, and the internet turned it into fire. On TikTok, the loop of Jasmine's stillness racked up millions of views before midnight. Her ID glowed on screen, held steady, ignored. The comments poured in like an avalanche. If that's how they treat her, what about us? This happened to my dad before his surgery. I've stayed quiet for years, but not anymore. On Twitter, hashtags stacked like Tinder, hashtag Gate22B, hashtag Dignity denied, hashtag Crockett removed. Each one spread faster than the last. The words weren't just digital, they were confessions. They were testimony. A veteran posted, "They pulled me off a flight in uniform. I missed my daughter's wedding. Watching her makes me feel seen." A nurse wrote, "I was searched in front of patients. I smiled so they wouldn't see me break. I cried at home. Now I'm crying again." A single mother added, "My kids watched me get patted down like a criminal. I told them it was normal. It shouldn't be normal." The country wasn't just watching, it was remembering. By 9 p.m., cable producers cut montages together. On-screen Jasmine's stillness at the gate. Franklin Rhodes stepping into the hallway. The words "random review" repeated like a drum beat. One analyst shook his head. If her husband hadn't been a judge, would we even know this happened? The question hung like smoke. Church choirs practiced under dim lights, but in the pews afterward, the clip became the sermon. Grocery clerks whispered about it at checkout. Barbershops paused mid-conversation. Even hospital waiting rooms turned televisions up louder. Everywhere the clip appeared, silence followed. People stared. People remembered. And through it all, Jasmine herself said nothing. She didn't appear on camera. She didn't grant interviews. Her silence remained intact, and somehow that silence became the loudest sound of all. Because what people saw was not rage, not defiance, but dignity. Dignity in the face of indifference. Dignity in the face of humiliation. Dignity standing still while a system tried to erase it. By midnight, the storm had become uncontainable. Hashtags weren't just trending. They were flooding timelines, forcing their way into conversations no press release could smother. One late-night host tried to make a joke. It fell flat. The audience didn't laugh. They shifted uncomfortably, aware that humor couldn't erase what they had just seen. At 1 a.m., the clip appeared in Seoul. At 3 a.m., it trended in London. By dawn in Washington, the world wasn't asking why Jasmine anymore. It was asking something deeper. If a congresswoman could be dismissed, humiliated, silenced, what chance did anyone else have? The storm no longer belonged to networks, to politicians, or to institutions. It belonged to the people who recognized themselves in her silence, and the country for once could not look away. If the storm belonged to the people, the spin belonged to the institutions. At dawn, the first official statement appeared, 2 paragraphs crafted with surgical detachment. We regret the inconvenience caused. We value all customers equally. No names, no acknowledgement of the images already burned into millions of screens. Just language so sanitized it felt inhuman. Hours later, TSA issued its own release, the words designed like armor. Our officers responded to an airline request. With a single sentence, responsibility slid like a coin across a table. Airline to TSA, TSA back to airline, an endless loop of blame shifting polished into bureaucracy. But Americans knew the script. They'd seen it after police shootings, after corporate scandals, after every televised moment of injustice. The vague regret, the refusal to name the harmed, the insistence on procedure. On social media, the press releases were torn apart line by line, annotated in red like high school essays. This isn't an apology, one tweet read. It's an insurance policy. Another simply posted the TSA's statement over Jasmine's photo with the caption, "So, whose request was it?" Commentators on cable news dissected every syllable, voices dripping with disbelief. That's not contrition and anchor spat, that's choreography. The phrase stuck, replayed across channels until choreography trended as its own hashtag. Meanwhile, reporters camped outside Jasmine's townhouse in DC, microphones raised desperate for her reaction. But she never appeared. No doorstep soundbite, no quick retort. She wasn't interested in being consumed by the same media cycle that had humiliated her. Instead, late at night in the quiet glow of a desk lamp, she reached for a yellow legal pad and wrote. Her words were sharp, deliberate, written with the weight of steel. This isn't about one gate. It isn't about one airline. It's about how easily dignity can be dismissed when no one is watching. When the letter was published the next morning, it cut through the fog of spin like lightning. Newspapers printed it in full. Morning anchors read passages aloud as if delivering scripture. Screenshots spread across social media faster than hashtags ever could. And with each share, people added their own testimony. Veterans, nurses, mothers, workers. Their silence had cracked, and Jasmine's letter had given them permission to speak. The institutions had spun as they always did. But this time their spin unraveled. Jasmine had written a truth too raw to bury, and the country was already carrying it in their hands, their voices, their lives. The church bells had already tolled by the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the terminal into the gray morning light. The weight of the missed flight pressed against her chest harder than the TSA's hands ever had. She found a quiet corner away from the cameras, away from the gawking eyes, and finally pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number she had been avoiding, the call she dreaded more than any confrontation in Washington. The line rang once, twice, then her mother's voice, soft but steady, filled her ear. "Baby, where are you?" The question cracked her open. Jasmine closed her eyes, forcing breath into her lungs. "Mama, I didn't make it. They stopped me at the airport." Silence followed, long and unbearable, only broken by the faint echo of a hymn drifting from the church speakers on the other end. She could hear the shuffle of people taking their seats, the muffled cough of a child, the world continuing without her. Her mother finally spoke, voice breaking under the weight of restraint. "He would have been proud of you, Jazz. Proud that you didn't bow your head." The words cut deeper than condemnation. Pride wasn't enough. Devin's daughter had asked if Auntie Jazz would say something at the service, and Jasmine had promised. Now that promise was shattered, replaced with images of a little girl waiting for a voice that never came. Guilt gnawed at her ribs like teeth sharper than humiliation, heavier than anger. The funeral wasn't just a farewell, it was a chance to give her cousin dignity in death. Dignity stolen from her in life by strangers with badges and smirks. Her mother tried to stay strong, filling the silence with gentle reassurances, but every word cracked at the edges. Jasmine gripped the phone tighter, fighting back the tears clawing to escape. "I should have been there," she whispered, her voice nearly gone. "I should have been sitting next to you." The response came soft, trembling. "You were where they forced you to be. That's not on you." But Jasmine couldn't believe it. The system might have stolen her flight, but it was her family who carried the cost. She sat on the curb outside the terminal, the hum of taxis and the roar of departing jets mocking her. Every sound reminded her of the distance between her and the church pews in Jackson. She pictured the casket lowering, her mother clutching a handkerchief, her cousin's daughter staring at the door, waiting for an entrance that never came. It was an absence that would echo for years, an empty space no apology or headline could ever fill. And in that moment, the fury that had smoldered beneath her, calm all morning, surged again. Not wild, not reckless, but controlled, precise, like a blade pulled from fire. They had humiliated her, yes, but worse, they had stolen something sacred. And that theft transformed her grief into resolve, a vow written not in words, but in the silence she carried like armor. The funeral was gone. The chance to keep her promise was gone. But Jasmine Crockett knew one truth as she sat in that cold, uncaring morning: what had been taken from her would not be forgotten, and the weight of absence would become the weight of reckoning. The back room smelled of burnt coffee and stale air, a place where mistakes were meant to be buried, not confessed. Cullen sat hunched in a plastic chair, his name tag tilted sideways, his hands knotted together so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. The smirk that had once curled his lips at the counter was gone. In its place lingered a hollow stare fixed on the floor. He muttered words he barely wanted to hear himself say. She seemed difficult. The sentence floated in the air, like a poison too thin to stand on, too heavy to erase. Across from him, the manager stood, rigid arms, folded eyes burning through the dim light. Difficult, he snapped the word, fired back like a bullet. She asked why her seat was reassigned. That's all. And you called security? Cullen shifted his throat, tightening his voice, cracking, as if he'd swallowed shards of glass. I thought she was going to make a scene. The manager cut him off with a scowl sharp enough to wound. You don't get to treat people like that. Not her, not anyone. Title or no title. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than the cheap walls surrounding them. The hum of a vending machine filled the void, mocking the weight of what had just been revealed. Cullen's confession wasn't about policy or protocol. It was about perception, about a snap judgment delivered with a smirk that carried the power to derail lives. He hadn't seen a grieving woman trying to reach her cousin's funeral. He had seen a problem to be neutralized, a box to be checked, an inconvenience to be removed. That was the rot, not in one man, but in the system that allowed it to fester unnoticed until the world was watching. The manager leaned closer, voice dropping into something colder, sharper. Do you realize what you've done? You escalated a non-confrontation into a national story. You dragged this airline into fire because you couldn't read the difference between a question and a threat. Cullen swallowed hard, sweat beating at his temples. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew the truth. There had been no threat, no danger, no cause. Just a judgment born of arrogance and sharpened by bias, dressed up as procedure. Outside the break room, the storm was growing louder. Phones ringing off the hook, passengers demanding statements, reporters circling like hawks. But in here, in the half-lit space, meant for staff to rest between shifts, the truth hung naked. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror reflecting something far more dangerous. The kind of rot that doesn't appear overnight, but grows quietly unchecked until it infects everything it touches. The manager's voice cracked like thunder in the cramped room. You don't get to humiliate someone because they seem difficult. You don't get to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. His glare pinned Cullen to the chair, stripping away every excuse. And if you think this is about who she is, Congresswoman or not, you've missed the point. This is about decency, and you forgot it the second you opened your mouth. Cullen lowered his head, shame-carving lines into his face deeper than exhaustion ever could. The hum of the vending machine returned louder now, a reminder of the silence that followed his ruin. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. The system wasn't broken by accident, it was rotting from the inside, one whispered judgment at a time. Jasmine Crockett didn't choose a podium or a press conference. She chose paper, ink, and silence. Alone in her study, the lamp's glow fell across her desk as she wrote in long, deliberate strokes. Every line carried the sting of humiliation, the ache of absence, the fire of defiance. She didn't write to the airline. She didn't write to TSA. She wrote to America. Her letter began with a blade. Power isn't a badge or a seat in Congress. Power is dignity, and dignity is something no one can strip from you. The words bled with truth, steady and unflinching. She didn't dwell on her title, her office, or her status. Instead, she wrote about the simple right to stand in a line, ask a question, and not be treated as less. She wrote about how institutions forget and how ordinary people pay the price. By morning, the letter was everywhere. Newspapers printed it in full. Television anchors read passages aloud like scripture. On social media, screenshots spread faster than hashtags carried not by outrage alone, but by recognition. People didn't just share it, they added their own voices. A veteran wrote, "They pulled me off a flight in uniform because I questioned why my bag was searched. I missed my son's graduation. A mother confessed they detained me until I missed my surgery prep. I never told anyone, until now." Stories poured in like a flood. Missed funerals, missed weddings, missed final goodbyes. Each one a scar, invisible, until Jasmine's words made the nation see them all at once. America was staring into a mirror it had avoided for too long, and the reflection was raw. It wasn't about one gate, one airline, or one woman. It was about a culture of dismissal, casual cruelty written off as routine. The emotional wave crested higher with each hour. Newsrooms stitched together montages, Jasmine's stillness at the gate, her letters' words on the screen, faces of ordinary people recounting their own humiliations. The country saw itself, and for once it couldn't look away. Her silence, once used against her, had become the weapon she wielded best. Jasmine didn't appear on camera that day. She didn't need to. Her letter spoke louder than any interview could. It had turned private grief into public reckoning, her pain into a chorus of voices too vast to ignore. For millions, she was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a mirror, a reminder, and a spark. And as her words ricocheted through homes, schools, churches, and screens, one question spread with them, sharp and unrelenting. How many silent humiliations go unspoken until someone stands still and refuses to bow? The flood began with envelopes, plain white, scrawled in shaky handwriting, stacked in teetering piles outside her congressional office. Then came the emails, thousands of them, subject lines that read, "It happened to me," or "You're not alone." By the end of the week, Jasmine Crockett's staff had to bring in extra bins just to contain the surge. She read them late into the night, jaw-tight fingers, tracing each page as though steadying the weight of invisible scars. Some letters were brief, a few sentences describing humiliation at a gate or the ache of missing a milestone. Others stretched for pages, decades of silence poured onto paper for the first time. Each story was different, yet the rhythm was the same, a moment of dismissal, a loss of dignity, a silence carried like a stone in the chest. One veteran's story struck hardest. He described being detained while wearing his uniform medals glinting on his chest until he missed his daughter's wedding. "They saluted me when I deployed." He wrote bitterly, but treated me like a criminal when I came home. Jasmine placed his letter flat on her desk, pressing her palm against it, as though holding down his grief to keep it from scattering. Another came from a nurse in Houston. She had escorted two elderly patients through security, only to be singled out, her bag dumped on the floor in front of them. "I didn't cry until I got home," she confessed, "because I couldn't let them see me break." Jasmine read the line 3 times, imagining the forced composure, the ache of performing strength in the face of injustice. But it was the stories of mothers that broke her heart wide open. One wrote of being searched in front of her children, forced to explain why strangers were touching her body as if she were dangerous. "I told my daughter it was routine," she wrote, "but she saw the fear in my eyes." Jasmine closed her own eyes, hearing echoes of her cousin's little girl. In those words, the same innocence fractured by adult cruelty. The stories multiplied, forming a chorus too loud to dismiss. They were not headlines. They were human. Missed funerals, missed graduations, missed surgeries. Each account was a scar invisible to strangers, yet unforgettable to those who bore them. For Jasmine, the realization was both devastating and clarifying. What had happened at Gate 22B was not an isolated humiliation. It was a thread in a vast woven tapestry of quiet cruelties suffered daily by people without cameras, without platforms, without judges, walking through automatic doors to defend them. Her pain was not unique, it was a mirror, and America was beginning at last to look into it. The gymnasium lights buzzed overhead, casting pale shadows across crooked rows of folding chairs. Jackets hung over railings. Coffee cups balanced on the floor. The air was restless, thick with murmurs. They hadn't come for charts. They hadn't come for policy. They had come to be heard. Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage with no notes, no teleprompter, no prepared talking points. In her hands was a worn folder, bulging with letters, envelopes, bent pages, creased ink smudged by tears. She didn't start with greetings. She didn't thank donors. She opened the folder and began with a story. The first was the veterans. She unfolded the letter slowly, her voice steady as she read his words. They saluted me when I deployed. But when I came home, they pulled me out of line and kept me until I missed my daughter's wedding. The audience shifted. Some gasped. And then in the third row, the veteran himself stood shoulders, shaking hand, pressed against his mouth. The gym went silent, the kind of silence that feels like it belongs in a church. Next came the mother's letter. Jasmine's tone wavered only once I told my daughter it was routine. But she saw the fear in my eyes. At the front, a woman rose her child clinging to her sleeve. She didn't speak. She only nodded. The child looked up wide-eyed and the silence cracked into sobs. The entire room seemed to lean forward, bound together by recognition. Jasmine read more. A nurse who smiled through humiliation so her patients wouldn't panic. A teacher who missed a funeral after being pulled aside for random review. A worker who lost wages when his bag was dumped in front of strangers. Each story landed like a gavel. The gymnasium transformed no longer a political event, but a tribunal, a reckoning. And then something unexpected happened. People stood, one after another, not to ask questions, not to argue policy, to testify. A man raised his hand, voice breaking. They kept me on the side of the terminal until my father's casket had already landed. A young woman added, I was searched so aggressively my hands shook for days. I didn't tell anyone, until now. An older woman clutched her purse. I prayed it wouldn't happen to my grandson. Now I see it never stopped happening. Every story layered over the next, a chorus of voices filling the rafters. The hum of fluorescent lights was drowned out by lived experience. Reporters in the back scribbled furiously, cameras rolling, but Jasmine didn't look their way. She stayed with the people in front of her. When the chants began, she didn't silence them. Crockett, Crockett echoed through the steel beams above, but Jasmine shook her head softly. Not for me, she said, her voice low but caring. For you, for each of you. She lifted the folder high, the pages trembling in her grip. These aren't my words, they're yours, and they will be heard. The gymnasium thundered. Some shouted, some wept. Some simply stood still, hands pressed against their hearts. In that moment, the boundaries between congresswoman and constituent dissolved. They weren't listening to a story. They were the story. A local pastor stepped forward, hand raised like in prayer. This is not politics. This is dignity. His words ignited the room. People clapped, stamped feet, voices swelling into chants that weren't about parties or platforms, but about worth, about decency. Cameras captured it all, but for once the footage wasn't spectacle. It was solidarity. And as Jasmine lowered the folder, her eyes swept across the crowd, veterans, nurses, mothers, workers, ordinary faces carrying extraordinary pain. The weight of silence had finally cracked. Their voices filled the space once reserved for speeches and slogans. It was no longer a town hall. It was a tribunal of the people. And their verdict was clear: dignity must not be optional. The headlines shifted quickly, as they always do when institutions feel the walls closing in. Airline unions stepped forward, first voices sharpened, declaring their staff had acted appropriately under difficult circumstances. TSA followed with a line delivered like a shield. Our officers followed established protocol. Each statement was meant to smother the outrage, to rewrite humiliation as procedure, to reduce Jasmine Crockett's pain into nothing more than policy. But outside their press rooms, the country wasn't buying it. The footage was too clear. The silence was too loud. Commentators on television clashed like boxers in the ring. Some parroted the official line, clinging to the word protocol like a lifeboat in rising water. Others unleashed fury, pointing to the video, to the stories spilling from ordinary Americans, to the moment Franklin Rhodes cut through the lies with one line of truth. The storm no longer belonged to institutions. It belonged to the people who saw themselves in Jasmine's humiliation. Every spin attempt only tightened the noose around those trying to escape accountability. At her next town hall, the air carried that storm inside. Reporters baited her with questions, each one designed to corner her, to drag her into a shouting match with the airline, with TSA with the entire machine. But Jasmine refused. She didn't match their fire with fire. She answered with calm, deliberate defiance. Standing on the stage, the letters still in her hand, she looked across the faces of veterans, mothers, workers, and said, "They want me to fight their narrative." But this was never about narrative. This was about dignity. Her words rolled across the gymnasium like thunder, striking with more force than any press release. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in tears. Jasmine lifted her voice one final time, cutting through the noise, leaving no room for doubt. It should never take a title to earn respect. Not for me, not for anyone. Respect is the ground we stand on, and they cracked it beneath us. Her tone was steady, but it carried the weight of every story she had read, every humiliation confessed, every silent pain now spoken aloud. The chants returned, swelling through the rafters, drowning out the hum of cameras and the clicking of reporters' pens. It was not applause for politics. It was recognition, solidarity, fury, sharpened into hope. Jasmine stood still, letting it rise, letting it belong to the people who had claimed it. And as the storm outside grew louder, her words burned brighter, leaving behind a question no union, no agency, no institution could spin away. Can one woman's humiliation force a nation to confront its quiet cruelty? In a tower of glass and steel high above the city, the airline's executives gathered around a mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine. The view of the skyline stretched endlessly behind them, but no one looked at it. Their eyes were fixed on the glowing headlines projected across the wall, Crockett removed. Congresswoman humiliated. Millions demand answers. The words burned hotter than the coffee cooling untouched in porcelain mugs. The atmosphere stank of fear disguised as control. Suits leaned forward, voices clipped and urgent. One slammed a printout onto the table emails from outraged customers threatening boycotts. Another scrolled through footage of hashtags trending into the millions. Every tap of a keyboard was a countdown. This cannot become a pattern. One executive snapped his jaw tight. "We can't allow her story to turn into the story." Another replied, his voice colder. "It already has. The problem isn't the incident. It's the optics." The phrase landed like poison. They weren't planning reform. They were plotting survival. Their language was calculated, their panic rehearsed. Isolated incident. Routine procedure. Safety is our priority. The words were shuffled like playing cards ready to be dealt to the public. Yet even as they recited the script, unease lingered in the room. A younger executive voice, trembling, broke the rhythm. What if she doesn't stop? The question sucked the oxygen out of the room. Chairs creaked. Pens froze mid-tap. Every gaze turned toward him. For a moment, no one spoke. And then the truth cracked through the silence. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a storm. One older man, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light, leaned back and exhaled slowly. "We don't fight her directly," he murmured. "We dilute. We deflect. We wait until the country finds a new distraction." Murmurs of approval circled the table, the same strategy that had buried scandals for decades. But the confidence didn't stick. The screen behind them kept flashing her face, her silence. Her words now etched into headlines across the nation. Outside that boardroom, America was no longer buying apologies. Outside, people were marching with signs, reposting videos, writing letters. The executives shuffled papers, straightened ties, tried to cloak their unease in authority. But the truth lingered heavy as stone, for once their spin might not be enough. And for the first time, they feared a single congresswoman more than Wall Street regulators or shareholders. She wasn't threatening their stock. She was threatening their story. The first call came late at night. Jasmine Crockett sat in her study, the desk lamp, casting a pool of light over scattered letters when her phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was polished, too careful, each syllable smoothed by training. He introduced himself as a liaison. He spoke of regret, of unfortunate misunderstandings, of a company eager to make amends. His tone dripped civility, but beneath it lay desperation. He whispered a number, compensation, enough to erase headlines, enough to buy silence. Jasmine let the words wash over her, her eyes fixed on the window where the night sky glowed faintly over D.C. Then she cut him off with steel. "This isn't about money," she said, "and it isn't about me. It's about what happens when no one is watching." The line went quiet, the man fumbling before retreating. By morning, the offers had grown bolder. A lifetime first-class membership card slid across the table at a quiet D.C. restaurant. No more waiting in line. No more pat-downs. "You'll never face this again," the emissary promised. Jasmine pressed the card back toward him, her fingers steady. "That's exactly the problem," she replied. "You want to fix it for me when you should be fixing it for everyone else." His smile cracked. Next came the photo ops disguised as opportunities. Invitations to private meetings, with executives listening sessions, with TSA leadership. They dangled influence like bait, hoping her presence would serve as proof of progress while silencing her voice. But Jasmine refused. "I will not be your prop," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the practiced charm. "You don't get to buy my silence with boardrooms and cameras." Word spread quickly. The Congresswoman could not be softened. Not by checks, not by perks, not by promises. Every rejection echoed louder than the offers themselves. The machine had underestimated her resolve, believing every storm could be calmed with luxury or influence. But Jasmine Crockett was not negotiating for herself. She was standing for the people who had written her, for the voices that couldn't be silenced with lifetime upgrades or private dinners. The softening campaign collapsed under its own weight. Their desperation revealed their guilt. Their offers revealed their fear, and Jasmine's refusals revealed the truth: dignity cannot be purchased. And dignity was all she demanded. That night, rain tapped against the windows of their townhouse like 1,000 small knocks. Jasmine Crockett sat curled on the edge of the sofa, her blazer draped over the armrest, fatigue etched into the lines of her face. The phone on the table buzzed with unanswered calls, offers, threats, invitations disguised as olive branches. She ignored them all. Her hands trembled slightly, the same hands that had carried letters from strangers. The same hands searched at Gate 22B as if they belonged to a criminal. Franklin Rhodes entered quietly, the weight of his presence filling the silence. He lowered himself beside her, not as a judge, but as a husband who had weathered storms of his own. He studied her face, the crease in her brow, the dimmed fire in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice cracked like glass. "Maybe it would be easier if I just stopped fighting." The words hung, heavy, dangerous. Franklin reached for her hand, his grip firm, grounding. "No," he said softly, but with the force of a verdict. "That's what they want. That's what the system feeds on. Your silence would be their victory." His tone wasn't raised, but it carried the authority of every courtroom he had ever commanded. He tilted her chin, meeting her eyes. "Real power isn't in the titles they give you or the seats they assign. Real power is knowing who you are and refusing to let them strip that away." The words struck like steel, hammered into shape. Jasmine's eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. Franklin squeezed her hand, transferring strength, a silent oath. "You're not alone in this," he continued. "Your voice carries millions. Every letter, every face in those town halls, they're your armor. And together we're the compass. Don't let them steer you off course." She rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing slowing the storm inside, quieting. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, the rain falling harder like applause from an unseen audience. The world would continue to spin its defenses. Institutions would keep hiding behind procedures. But with Franklin's counsel echoing in her chest, Jasmine knew retreat was no longer an option. Her silence at Gate 22B had been weaponized against her. Now silence would be her weapon. Not surrender, but strength. And as she sat beside the man who had turned a hallway into a courtroom, she whispered to herself, steady and defiant, "They won't win." Union Station pulsed with morning chaos. The hiss of trains, the murmur of announcements, the endless shuffle of shoes against marble floors. Jasmine Crockett sat alone on a worn wooden bench, her coat draped loosely across her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee she had forgotten to drink. Commuters rushed past her in blurs of gray and black eyes, fixed on schedules, earbuds, and faces lost in their own battles. To them, she was invisible, just another traveler waiting for time to pass. But inside her silence moved with purpose. Her phone rested on her lap screen, glowing faintly, the cursor blinking like a pulse. She opened a draft and began to type each word deliberate, each line a decision. Next town hall begins with a story, not a policy. She paused, staring at the words as the station roared around her. This was the pivot, the moment where the spectacle of her humiliation transformed into something heavier, something lasting. She wasn't just going to recount what had been done to her. She was going to tell America what it had done to itself. As she typed, faces from the letters returned to her mind: the veteran missing his daughter's wedding, the mother broken in front of her children, the nurse humiliated in silence. Their voices blended with the noise of the station, a chorus louder than the arrival bells echoing overhead. She wrote not for herself, not for the headlines that still carried her name, but for them. The draft wasn't policy, it wasn't politics, it was legacy. Jasmine leaned back, watching a train pull out its windows, flashing with strangers rushing toward futures that could so easily be disrupted by the same cruelty she had endured. The thought tightened her grip on the phone, her resolve hardening with it. This wasn't about a gate or a flight anymore. It was about the country's soul, about the dignity of people who would never stand behind a microphone, never make the news but deserve to be heard. And as she hit Save the Station's chaos blurred into a kind of clarity, the story would no longer belong to her alone. It would belong to everyone. What began as a confrontation in a crowded terminal now echoed inside the marble halls of Congress. Committees convened under hot lights, cameras rolling as lawmakers demanded answers about airline discrimination and TSA overreach. Jasmine Crockett sat silently at the witness table, not as the victim, but as the catalyst, her presence forcing the system to look itself in the eye. Her story had cracked the surface, and now the flood was pouring through. Families stepped forward, voices trembling as they told their truths. A veteran testified about being pulled from a line until he missed his daughter's graduation. A nurse spoke of the humiliation she endured in front of her patients. A mother described her children crying as officers searched her, their small hands gripping hers in fear. Each story landed with the weight of a gavel, undeniable, unspinnable. The hearings weren't abstract policy debates anymore. They were confessions written in human cost. Behind the scenes, staffers whispered apologies in hallways, avoiding Jasmine's gaze, but unable to escape their own complicity. Airline representatives squirmed in their seats, their rehearsed statements shredded by testimony too raw to counter. For the first time, the institutions that had hidden behind protocol found themselves exposed under the unblinking glare of public scrutiny. The ripple that began at Gate 22B was no longer a ripple at all. It had become a wave. The hearings ended not with silence, but with promises, reforms drafted, accountability demanded, a system forced to confront what it had long ignored. Yet Jasmine knew this was only the beginning. As she rose from her seat, the cameras still flashing the chants from outside reached her ears, voices of ordinary people who had seen their own pain reflected and finally heard. The humiliation that once belonged to her alone had become the engine of reform, and the wave was still rising. The lights of Union Station glowed against the night sky as Jasmine Crockett walked toward the doors, her reflection stretching long across the polished floor. The noise of the city hummed around her, but inside her chest there was only stillness. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who had chosen not to bow. Her journey had begun at one gate in Dallas, but it had cracked something far larger, exposing the cost of everyday indignities that had gone unspoken for too long. In voiceover, her truth sharpened into words meant to outlast the moment. Most people think power comes with a desk or a badge. But true power is refusing to let anyone shrink you. True power is standing tall when the world wants you small. The images that followed weren't of boardrooms or hearings, but of the people who had shared their stories. The veteran, the mother, the nurse, the worker, faces ordinary and unforgettable, carried now by a movement that was bigger than one name. The camera lingered on her silhouette as she stepped into the night, the city lights burning like sparks of change around her. And as the scene faded, her voice returned, quiet but unshakable. In your own life, will you stand still when someone tries to make you small? Or will you let silence write your story? Life often tries to shrink us through dismissive looks, unfair treatment, or institutions that forget basic decency. Jasmine Crockett's story reminds us that true power isn't about titles or badges. It's about dignity and the courage to stand tall, even when others try to make you small. For those of us who've lived long enough to see how silence can bury truth, her defiance is a call to action. Never accept humiliation as routine. In your own life, will you stand firm when someone tries to diminish you, or will you let silence decide your story? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.